the inbred church of the Appalachians, where faith, incest, and hereditary evil became one curse. This is not a tale born from imagination. This is a hidden chapter of American history buried beneath the misty peaks of West Virginia, where a congregation chose isolation over salvation, and bloodlines became so intertwined that the very children born within those hills carried the marks of generations of forbidden unions. In the autumn of 1947, a young social worker named Eleanor Patterson received an assignment that would haunt her until her final breath. The West Virginia Department of Public Welfare had received troubling reports from the remote Greenbrier County, deep within the Appalachian Mountains. A community known locally as Hollow Creek had existed in almost complete isolation for nearly 80 years. The reports spoke of children with unusual physical characteristics, a church that held absolute power over its members, and families whose genealogical trees looked less like branches reaching outward and more like roots tangled upon themselves. Eleanor was 32 years old, a graduate of the University of Charleston, and had spent 6 years documenting poverty in rural communities. Nothing could have prepared her for what awaited in Hollow Creek. The journey itself was treacherous. The last paved road ended 12 miles before the settlement. Eleanor traveled the final stretch on a narrow dirt path carved into the mountainside, her government-issued vehicle struggling against the steep incline. The locals in the nearest town, Lewisburg, had warned her not to go. They spoke of Hollow Creek in hushed tones, calling it the place where God forgot to look. When Eleanor finally arrived, the scene before her seemed frozen in time. Wooden structures, weathered by decades of harsh mountain winters, lined a single unpaved street. There was no electricity, no telephone lines, no evidence of the modern world that existed just a few hours away. At the center of the settlement stood a church, larger than any other building, its white paint peeling, but its steeple still reaching defiantly toward the heavens. What struck Eleanor first were the faces. Children played in the dirt road, and as she stepped out of her vehicle, they stopped to stare. Their features were strikingly similar, as if the same face had been copied with slight variations across dozens of bodies. Prominent foreheads, closely set eyes, and jawlines that seemed either too pronounced or too receded. Some of the older children walked with pronounced limps. Others had hands with fewer fingers than nature intended. The founder of this community was a man named Ezekiel Witmore. According to county records that Eleanor had reviewed before her journey, Witmore had arrived in these mountains in 1868, just 3 years after the end of the Civil War. He was a former Confederate soldier from Virginia, deeply religious and deeply distrustful of the outside world. He brought with him his wife, Martha, his 3 sons, his 2 daughters, and a fervent belief that God had commanded him to establish a pure congregation, untainted by the corruption of modern society. Ezekiel Witmore preached that the bloodline of his family had been blessed by the Almighty. He taught that mixing with outsiders would dilute this blessing, bringing spiritual and physical ruin upon his descendants. Within the first decade of settlement, marriages were arranged exclusively within the founding families. By the second generation, the options for partners had become dangerously limited. By the third generation, first cousins were wedding first cousins. By the fourth, the unions had become even closer. The church that Ezekiel built was called the Congregation of the Sacred Lineage. Its doctrine was simple but devastating. The purity of the bloodline must be preserved at all costs. Marriage to outsiders was not merely discouraged. It was declared a mortal transgression, punishable by permanent exile from the community and eternal damnation in the afterlife. For the residents of Hollow Creek, there was no world beyond those mountains. The congregation was their universe, and Ezekiel Witmore and his descendants were their absolute authorities. Eleanor Patterson stood in that dirt road on that October afternoon in 1947, and she understood immediately that she had stumbled upon something far more disturbing than rural poverty. This was a community that had been conducting a terrible experiment upon itself for nearly 4 generations, and the results were written in the bodies and faces of every person who called Hollow Creek home. An elderly woman approached Eleanor with suspicion carved into every line of her weathered face. She introduced herself as Sister Agnes, and she demanded to know why an outsider had violated the sanctity of their settlement. Eleanor explained that she was from the state government, that she had come to assess the well-being of the children. Sister Agnes laughed, a sound without joy. The children of Hollow Creek, Sister Agnes declared, were blessed. They bore the marks of their sacred lineage. Any differences in their appearance or abilities were signs of God's special attention, not afflictions to be pitied by ignorant outsiders. Eleanor would spend 3 days in Hollow Creek during that first visit. What she documented would eventually reach the desks of state officials, medical professionals, and journalists. But the full truth of what had transpired in that mountain community, the depth of the tragedy that had unfolded across generations, would take years to fully emerge. The congregation of the sacred lineage had been hiding something far worse than unusual physical characteristics. Behind the doors of that white church and the records kept by successive generations of Witmore leaders lay evidence of a systematic practice that had produced not just physical deformities but profound cognitive impairments, shortened lifespans, and a pattern of infant mortality that defied explanation without understanding. The true nature of the unions that produced those children, confira se J inscrito nel canal. These hidden American histories are being erased, and only together can we ensure they are never forgotten. Subscribe now to witness the truths that others refuse to tell. The documentation that Eleanor Patterson gathered during her initial visit to Hollow Creek was disturbing enough to warrant a full investigation. By November of 1947, a team of 3 additional social workers and a physician from Charleston had joined her in the remote settlement. Dr. Harold Brennan, a general practitioner with 20 years of experience in Appalachian communities, had seen poverty and its effects on health throughout his career. He had never seen anything like Hollow Creek. The congregation had grown wary of the outsiders, but they could not prevent the investigation entirely. State law required cooperation with welfare assessments, and the current leader of the community, Pastor Ezekiel Witmore, the great-grandson of the founder, grudgingly allowed limited access to the settlement. Dr. Brennan conducted examinations of 47 children under the age of 15. His findings painted a picture of systematic genetic deterioration. 18 of the children showed signs of developmental delays ranging from mild to severe. 23 exhibited physical anomalies including cleft palates, club feet, skeletal abnormalities, and heart murmurs. 11 had significant vision impairments. 8 had hearing loss. But it was the church records that revealed the true horror of what had transpired over the generations. Pastor Ezekiel Witmore maintained what he called the Book of Lineages, a leather-bound volume that documented every birth, marriage, and passing within the congregation since its founding. Eleanor Patterson convinced him to allow her to examine this document, arguing that it would prove the community's claim of divine blessing. What the Book of Lineages revealed instead was a genealogical nightmare. The original Witmore family had indeed arrived with 7 members in 1868. They were joined within the first year by 2 other families, the Carters and the Hensleys, who shared Ezekiel Witmore's religious convictions and his distrust of the outside world. These 3 families, totaling 19 individuals, formed the entire founding population of Hollow Creek. By 1880, just 12 years later, the first generation of children born in Hollow Creek had reached marriageable age. The Book of Lineages recorded 6 unions that year. All 6 were between first cousins. The entries continued through the decades, and the pattern only intensified. By 1900, the community had grown to 73 members, but the genetic diversity had actually decreased. A significant portion of children born in the 1890s did not survive past their 5th year. The Book of Lineages recorded these passings with simple notations: return to the Lord, blessed innocents departed, or simply taken. What the book did not record, but what Eleanor Patterson pieced together through careful analysis, was the true relationship between many of these unions. By the 1920s, the available marriage partners had become so limited that unions between half-siblings had become common. By the 1930s, there was evidence that even closer familial bonds had been breached. The congregation had developed an elaborate theological justification for these practices. Pastor Ezekiel Witmore explained it to Eleanor with the sincere conviction of a true believer. He spoke of the biblical patriarchs, of Abraham and Sarah, who were half-siblings, of the necessity of preserving pure bloodlines in a corrupt world. He spoke of how God had created Adam and Eve as the only humans, and their children had necessarily married one another to populate the earth. If it was good enough for the creation of humanity, Witmore argued, it was good enough for the congregation of the sacred lineage. Eleanor Patterson had studied enough history to recognize this argument. It had been used throughout centuries by royal families, by isolated communities, by anyone seeking to justify practices that the wider world recognized as harmful. But hearing it spoken with such conviction, in defense of the suffering she had witnessed in the faces of Hollow Creek's children, filled her with a combination of horror and profound sadness. The physical effects of generations of close familial unions were evident everywhere she looked, but the psychological and social effects were equally devastating. The children of Hollow Creek had no understanding of the outside world. They could not read beyond simple biblical passages. They had no knowledge of geography, science, or history beyond the boundaries of their valley. Many of the adults, products of these same unions, struggled with basic reasoning. They followed the instructions of their religious leaders without question, not because of deep faith alone, but because they lacked the cognitive capacity to envision alternatives. The women of Hollow Creek bore particular burdens. They were expected to marry young, often by age 14 or 15, and to produce as many children as possible to continue the sacred lineage. Many experienced multiple losses, their bodies giving birth to children who could not survive the genetic damage they carried. These losses were explained as God's will, as tests of faith, as purification of the bloodline. The women were forbidden from expressing grief, from questioning why so many of their babies never drew breath or survived only days. One woman, whom Eleanor called Mary in her official reports to protect her identity, spoke privately to the social worker during the investigation. Mary was 28 years old but looked decades older, her body worn by 7 pregnancies that had produced only 2 surviving children. She whispered to Eleanor about the things she had seen, the babies born with bodies so malformed that even the midwives gasped. The children who reached age 5 or 6 before their hearts simply stopped. The slow realization that had crept over her through the years that something was deeply wrong with her community. Mary had tried to speak to Pastor Witmore about her concerns. She had been told that her doubts were the whispers of the devil, that questioning the sacred lineage was the gravest transgression possible. She had been made to kneel before the congregation and confess her sinful thoughts. She had been warned that further questioning would result in exile, separation from her surviving children, and eternal punishment. Mary stayed silent after that. She watched her remaining children grow, praying that they would be spared the worst effects of their heritage, knowing that they would soon be expected to continue the cycle by marrying within the limited pool of available partners. Dr. Brennan compiled his medical findings into a report that he submitted to the West Virginia State Health Department in January of 1948. He recommended immediate intervention, including the removal of children from the community and criminal investigation of the leadership. His report used clinical language to describe what he called a systematic pattern of consanguineous unions, resulting in significant genetic deterioration across multiple generations. The response from state officials was not what Dr. Brennan or Eleanor Patterson had hoped for. The post-war period was a time of limited government resources and competing priorities. The remote location of Hollow Creek made intervention logistically difficult. There were concerns about religious freedom, about the rights of communities to live according to their beliefs. There were also, though no official would admit it publicly, concerns about the political implications of exposing such a community to national attention. The investigation was quietly closed in the spring of 1948. Eleanor Patterson received instructions to move on to other assignments. Dr. Brennan returned to his practice in Charleston. The children of Hollow Creek remained in their valley, continuing to bear the physical and psychological marks of their heritage. But the story did not end there. The documentation that Eleanor and Dr. Brennan had created would remain in government archives, waiting for a time when society was more willing to confront the truth of what had happened in those Appalachian mountains. The years following the 1948 investigation brought subtle changes to Hollow Creek, though the fundamental practices of the Congregation of the Sacred Lineage continued unabated. The outside world was beginning to encroach upon even the most isolated Appalachian communities. The construction of new highways brought travelers closer to the remote valleys. Electricity reached neighboring towns. Radio signals carried news of a world that was rapidly changing. Pastor Jeremiah Whitmore responded to these developments by drawing his congregation even further inward. He preached that the spreading modernization was evidence of the approaching end times, that the faithful must maintain their separation more vigilantly than ever. The marriages continued, the children continued to be born, and the physical evidence of generations of closed lineage continued to accumulate. By 1955, a new generation of social workers had inherited the case files from Eleanor Patterson's investigation. Among them was a young woman named Carol Hendricks, who had recently graduated from Marshall University with a degree in social work and a particular interest in isolated Appalachian communities. Carol requested permission to conduct a follow-up visit to Hollow Creek. Her supervisors initially refused, citing the sensitivity of the case and the lack of actionable findings from the previous investigation. Carol persisted. She argued that 7 years had passed, that conditions may have changed, that the children documented in 1947 would now be teenagers approaching marriageable age within the community. Her permission was finally granted in August of 1955. What Carol Hendricks found when she reached Hollow Creek was a community that had continued its decline. The population had actually decreased since Eleanor Patterson's visit. The mortality rate among infants and young children remained staggeringly high. The physical characteristics that had marked the residents had become more pronounced in the younger generation. Carol documented her observations with the same meticulous care that Eleanor had employed. She photographed the children with the reluctant permission of their parents. She interviewed community members, though most would speak only in the presence of church elders. She examined the book of lineages, now containing another 7 years of entries. One individual in particular captured Carol's attention. A young man named Thomas, who was listed in the church records as 18 years old, though his physical development suggested someone much younger. Thomas had been born in 1937, the son of parents who were, according to the book of lineages, first cousins. His grandparents on both sides had also been first cousins. The pattern continued back through the generations. Thomas could not walk without assistance. His spine had developed with severe curvature, his legs were of unequal length, and his hips had formed improperly. He could speak, though his words were often difficult to understand due to malformation of his palate. His vision was severely limited. Yet despite these challenges, Thomas possessed something that Carol found remarkable: a keen intelligence that had somehow survived the genetic damage inflicted upon his body. Thomas had taught himself to read beyond the simple biblical passages that were the extent of formal education in Hollow Creek. He had found discarded newspapers and magazines that occasionally made their way into the valley, carried by the rare visitor or discovered in the belongings of community members who had made trips to nearby towns. Through these fragments of the outside world, Thomas had begun to understand that life beyond the mountains was vastly different from what Pastor Witmore described. More significantly, Thomas had begun to understand what had happened to him and to his community. He spoke to Carol Hendricks in private during a moment when the church elders were occupied with other matters. His words, though sometimes difficult to understand, painted a picture of a young man who had spent years piecing together a terrible truth. Thomas explained that he had studied the book of lineages. He had traced his own ancestry back through the generations. He had counted the names, noticed the patterns, recognized how the same handful of family lines appeared again and again in different combinations. He had watched his siblings and cousins struggle with the same physical and cognitive challenges that affected him. He had witnessed babies born who survived only hours, their bodies unable to sustain life. Thomas had reached a conclusion that no one in Hollow Creek was willing to speak aloud. The sacred lineage was not blessed. It was cursed, not by any supernatural force, but by the simple biological reality of what happened when family lines closed in upon themselves generation after generation. If this story has touched something deep within you, if you feel the weight of Thomas's realization, then you understand why these hidden histories must be told. Leave a comment right now saying Thomas deserved better. Let your voice join with others who refuse to let these forgotten victims remain silent. Your comment is not just words, it is an act of recognition for all those who suffered in isolation. Carol Hendricks recorded Thomas's testimony in her official report. She recommended that he be removed from the community and provided with appropriate medical care and education. She recommended the same for numerous other children she had documented. She recommended criminal investigation of the church leadership for their role in perpetuating practices that had caused such documented harm. The response from state officials in 1955 was similar to the response in 1948. There were concerns about resources, about jurisdiction, about religious freedom. The Cold War was intensifying and government attention was focused on external threats rather than isolated domestic communities. The recommendations were filed away. Thomas remained in Hollow Creek. He would never leave those mountains. The 1960s brought profound changes to America. The civil rights movement challenged long-held assumptions about equality and human dignity. The Great Society programs expanded the role of government in addressing poverty and social welfare. A new generation of journalists and activists began exposing injustices that had long been hidden from public view. It was in this context that Hollow Creek finally received sustained outside attention. In the summer of 1963, a journalist named Robert Caldwell was researching a series of articles on poverty in Appalachia for a regional newspaper. His investigation led him to the archived case files from Eleanor Patterson's 1947 visit and Carol Hendricks's 1955 follow-up. What he read compelled him to make his own journey to the remote valley. Robert Caldwell was not a social worker bound by government protocols. He was not a physician constrained by professional ethics regarding patient privacy. He was a journalist with a mission to expose truth, and he possessed the resources and the platform to bring that truth to a wider audience. His arrival in Hollow Creek in September of 1963 coincided with a moment of crisis within the community. Pastor Jeremiah Witmore had passed away 2 years earlier, and leadership had transferred to his son Ezekiel Witmore II, named for the original founder. The younger Witmore lacked his father's charisma and absolute authority. Dissent had begun to surface among some community members, particularly those who had lost multiple children and were beginning to question the promised blessings. Robert Caldwell found community members willing to speak with him in ways that previous visitors had not experienced. The stories they told were devastating. One elderly woman who had been young when Eleanor Patterson first visited recounted the births of 9 children, only 3 of whom had survived to adulthood. She described the physical characteristics of those who had passed, the struggles of those who survived, the exhaustion of a life spent in grief and labor. She spoke of her own parents who had been cousins and her grandparents who had been even more closely related. She spoke of the wedding she had been forced into at age 15, to a man who was both her cousin and her uncle's son, a relationship so tangled that even she could not fully articulate it. Another community member, a man in his 40s who had been born with significant cognitive impairment, spoke haltingly about his understanding that something was wrong with his community. He could not articulate the scientific reality, but he knew from observation that the children of Hollow Creek were different from the children he had glimpsed during rare trips to nearby towns. He knew that the suffering he saw was not normal. Robert Caldwell also located Thomas, now 26 years old, still unable to walk independently, still possessed of the keen intelligence that Carol Hendricks had noted 8 years earlier. Thomas had continued his private education through whatever materials he could obtain. He had developed a sophisticated understanding of genetics pieced together from encyclopedia entries and discarded scientific magazines. He understood, in terms that would satisfy any medical professional, exactly what had happened to him and his community. Thomas spoke to Robert Caldwell for hours over several days. He provided names, dates, and relationships. He drew genealogical charts that illustrated the tangled web of unions that had produced his generation. He described the physical and cognitive effects he had witnessed, the patterns of mortality, the progression of deterioration across generations. Thomas also spoke of the psychological effects that no previous investigator had fully documented. He described the shame that permeated the community, the unspoken understanding that something was deeply wrong, the theological explanations that were repeated endlessly to paper over the visible evidence of biological reality. He described the absolute authority of the church leadership, the punishment inflicted upon those who questioned, the exile that awaited anyone who attempted to leave. Most heartbreakingly, Thomas described the children of his generation who had already begun marrying and producing offspring of their own. The pattern was continuing. The 6th generation from the original founders was now being born, carrying genetic damage that had accumulated across more than 90 years of close lineage. Robert Caldwell published his series of articles in October of 1963. The response was immediate and intense. State officials who had ignored previous reports could no longer maintain their inaction in the face of public scrutiny. A formal investigation was launched in November of 1963. Medical professionals, social workers, and law enforcement descended upon Hollow Creek in numbers that the community had never witnessed. The investigation documented 112 living residents. Of these, 87 showed physical evidence of genetic deterioration resulting from consanguineous unions. 63 exhibited cognitive impairment ranging from mild to severe. The Book of Lineages was seized as evidence and subjected to detailed genealogical analysis. The analysis confirmed what Thomas had discovered through his own research. By the 4th generation, virtually every child born in Hollow Creek was the product of unions that would be considered inappropriate by any standard outside the community. By the 5th generation, the genetic effects had become severe enough that a significant percentage of pregnancies ended in loss or produced children who could not survive infancy. Pastor Ezekiel Witmore II was arrested in December of 1963 on charges related to child welfare violations. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and controversial. Defense attorneys argued religious freedom. Prosecutors argued that no religious doctrine could justify the documented harm inflicted upon generations of children. The case never reached a definitive conclusion. Ezekiel Witmore II passed away in custody in February of 1964 before his trial could be completed. The cause was listed as heart failure, but those familiar with the medical records noted that he, too, had been a product of the unions that defined his community. The children of Hollow Creek were gradually removed from the settlement and placed in foster care or state institutions. Many struggled to adapt to the outside world they had never known. Some thrived with proper medical care and education. Others bore damage too severe to be remediated. Thomas was among those removed from Hollow Creek. He was placed in a state facility that provided medical care and educational opportunities. He would spend the remaining years of his life there, finally able to pursue the learning he had craved, finally able to understand fully the scientific reality of what had shaped his body and limited his life. Thomas passed away in 1971 at the age of 34. His heart, weakened by the genetic legacy of his heritage, simply stopped. Those who knew him in his final years described a man of remarkable intelligence and profound sadness. Someone who had understood too much about his own condition to find peace, but who had found purpose in ensuring that his story and the stories of his community would not be forgotten. The settlement of Hollow Creek was abandoned by 1965. The buildings that had housed the congregation of the sacred lineage were left to deteriorate, claimed slowly by the forest that surrounded them. The white church where Ezekiel Witmore had preached his doctrine of sacred bloodlines collapsed under the weight of snow in the winter of 1972. But the legacy of what had transpired in those mountains did not end with the physical destruction of the settlement. The former residents of Hollow Creek, those who survived and were integrated into the broader world, carried their heritage with them. Some married outside their community, introducing new genetic diversity into family lines that had been closed for nearly a century. Their children and grandchildren would bear fewer marks of the congregation's practices, though certain characteristics would continue to appear occasionally, genetic echoes of decisions made generations before. Others struggled to escape the psychological damage inflicted by their upbringing. The doctrine of the sacred lineage had been so deeply ingrained that even those who understood its falsehood intellectually could not fully free themselves emotionally. Some returned to isolated communities, seeking the familiarity of separation from the wider world. Some found religion elsewhere, transferring their need for absolute spiritual authority to other congregations. Some found only despair. The medical and social work communities drew important lessons from the Hollow Creek case. The documentation gathered by Eleanor Patterson, Carol Hendricks, and the investigators of 1963 became case study material for professionals training to work with isolated communities. The genetic analysis of the Witmore lineage contributed to scientific understanding of the effects of consanguinity across multiple generations. Perhaps most significantly, the Hollow Creek case helped establish legal and ethical frameworks for intervention in communities where cultural or religious practices were causing documented harm to children. The tension between religious freedom and child welfare, which had allowed state officials to ignore earlier reports, was re-examined in light of what had been allowed to continue for so long in those Appalachian mountains. The congregation of the sacred lineage was not unique. Similar communities had existed and continued to exist in isolated pockets throughout America and around the world. The factors that produced such communities, religious extremism, geographic isolation, distrust of the outside world, had been present throughout human history and would continue to create conditions where harmful practices could persist for generations. What made Hollow Creek significant was the completeness of its documentation. The testimony of Eleanor Patterson, Carol Hendricks, Robert Caldwell, the medical professionals, and most importantly the survivors themselves, created a record that could not be ignored or forgotten. Mary, the woman who had confided in Eleanor Patterson during the original investigation, survived to see her grandchildren born outside the community. She lived until 1978, spending her final years in a small apartment in Charleston, West Virginia, far from the mountains that had defined her early life. Before her passing, she gave an extended interview to a researcher documenting the history of isolated Appalachian communities. In that interview, Mary spoke of the weight she had carried throughout her life. She spoke of the children she had lost, the suffering she had witnessed, the years of silence she had endured. She spoke of the moment when outsiders finally came and the community was finally exposed to the judgment of the wider world. She spoke of the grief and the relief that had mingled together, the loss of everything she had known combined with the freedom from a burden she had carried since childhood. Mary's final words in that interview captured something essential about the tragedy of Hollow Creek. She said that the saddest thing was not what had happened to the bodies of the congregation's children. The saddest thing was what had happened to their souls. They had been taught that their suffering was holy, that their deformities were blessings, that their shortened lives were evidence of God's special attention. They had been denied the simple human understanding that they were victims of choices made by others, choices that should never have been made, choices that could have been stopped at any point if only the outside world had been willing to see and to act. The mountains of West Virginia still hold their secrets. The valley where Hollow Creek once stood has been reclaimed by forest, the foundations of buildings barely visible beneath decades of growth. Occasionally, a researcher or a journalist will make the journey to the site, attempting to locate physical evidence of what once existed there. They find little. Nature has been thorough in erasing the physical traces of the congregation of the sacred lineage, but the documentary evidence remains in archives throughout West Virginia and beyond. The photographs taken by Eleanor Patterson and Carol Hendricks, the genealogical analysis of the Book of Lineages, the medical reports documenting generation after generation of genetic deterioration, all of these survive as testament to what was allowed to happen in those isolated mountains. The story of Hollow Creek is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a warning about the consequences of isolation, of unchecked religious authority, of the human capacity to rationalize harm in the name of belief. It is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with dramatic villainy. Sometimes it grows quietly, generation after generation, hidden from view, justified by theology, enabled by the indifference of those who could have intervened but chose not to see. The inbred church of the Appalachians, where faith, incest, and hereditary evil became one curse. These words capture a reality that unfolded across nearly a century in an American valley that most people will never know existed. The children who were born and suffered and perished in Hollow Creek deserved better. They deserved a world that would not allow such practices to continue unchecked. They deserved the intervention that came too late for so many. Their story is now told. Let it serve as witness to what was, and as warning against what must never be allowed to happen again. If you watched until this moment, then you have walked through the shadows of Hollow Creek alongside the forgotten souls who lived and suffered there. You have witnessed a truth that most would prefer to remain buried. If you are still here, you are not merely a viewer. You are a witness. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end." Let me know who you are so I can recognize those who truly appreciate these hidden histories. Your presence here matters. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to chapters of history that deserve to be remembered, then subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another revelation. These stories exist because you choose to watch them, to share them, to ensure they are never forgotten. Give this video a like if you believe these voices deserve to be heard. Your like tells the algorithm that this content matters, that history should not be erased by indifference. And finally, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Share it with someone who believes they know American history, who thinks they understand the darkness that can grow in isolated places. Share it because some truths are too important to keep to ourselves. The mountains still stand. The valleys still hold their secrets. And as long as there are those willing to look, willing to listen, willing to remember, the forgotten victims of places like Hollow Creek will never truly be silenced. Until the next hidden history is revealed, remember, the past is never truly past. It echoes through generations, shaping the present in ways we are only beginning to understand.